The sun hung mercilessly in the copper sky above the town of Bitter Creek, its rays beating down on the cracked earth like hammers on an anvil. The year was 1873, and the American frontier stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of red dirt, burnt grass, and dreams that died as quickly as the men who chased them. Wind swept across the plains, carrying dust and the faint smell of sage, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that seemed to settle not just on buildings and wagons, but on the very souls of those who called this harsh land home. Margaret Sullivan stood at the window of her small clapboard house on the edge of town, her pale hands gripping the worn windowsill. At 24, she was already a widow, her youth buried alongside her husband Thomas in the cemetery behind the church. The black mourning dress she wore seemed to absorb the heat, making her feel as though she were slowly suffocating in the fabric of her grief. It had been 6 months since that terrible day. 6 months since riders had brought Thomas's body back to town, his chest torn open by arrows, his scalp. She couldn't think about that. The men had spoken in hushed tones about the attack, about how Thomas and 3 other settlers had ventured too far into disputed territory, seeking to expand their claims. They'd encountered a band of Comanche warriors, and none had survived the meeting. "Savages," the townspeople had whispered at the funeral. "Bloodthirsty savages." Margaret had stood at the graveside, her tears mixing with the dust, and made a vow that burned in her chest like a coal from hell itself. "I will never let one of those murderers touch me. Never, not as long as I draw breath." The memory faded as she heard footsteps on her porch. Margaret straightened her shoulders and opened the door to find Mrs. Elmira Hutchinson, the banker's wife, standing there with her perpetual expression of disapproval. "Margaret," the older woman said, her voice as dry as the wind. "I've come about the rent. I have until the end of the week. Mrs. Hutchinson, your husband agreed. That was before we heard about your activities." The woman's thin lips pressed together. "Taking in washing from the saloon girls? Have you no shame?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I need to eat. Mrs. Hutchinson, since Thomas died, I've had no income. The laundry work makes you no better than those trollops themselves. The decent women of this town have standards to maintain." She sniffed. "You have 3 days to find the rent money, or you'll need to find somewhere else to live." After the woman left, Margaret sank into the rickety chair by the cold stove. The house still smelled faintly of Thomas, tobacco and leather and the pomade he'd used to slick back his sandy hair. They'd been married only 2 years when he'd gotten it into his head to expand westward, to claim more land for farming. She'd begged him not to go, but he'd laughed off her fears. "Maggie, my love," he'd said, using the pet name only he called her. "We can't live in fear of every shadow. This is our chance to build something real, something that'll last." Something that'll last. The irony wasn't lost on her now. She rose and walked to the small mirror hanging by the door, studying her reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed a stranger, hollow cheeks where there had once been roses, dull green eyes that had once sparkled with laughter. Her auburn hair, which Thomas had loved to run his fingers through, was pulled back in a severe bun. She looked like what she was, a woman hollowed out by loss, aging before her time. The next morning, Margaret made her way into town with her chin held high, ignoring the whispers that followed her like tumbleweeds. At Henderson's general store, she waited patiently while Mrs. Henderson served other customers first, pretending not to see her. Finally, when the store was empty, the proprietress acknowledged her presence. "What do you need, Mrs. Sullivan?" "Just some cornmeal and salt, please, on credit. I'll have money by week's end." Mrs. Henderson's face pinched. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Henderson says we can't extend any more credit, not with your reputation." "My reputation?" Margaret's voice came out sharper than intended. "What reputation? That I'm a widow trying to survive? That you consort with unsavory types? That you've been seen near the reservation boundaries? People talk Mrs. Sullivan." Margaret left empty-handed, her stomach cramping with hunger. She'd been near the reservation only once, searching for Thomas's horse that had wandered home riderless after the attack. The magnificent bay stallion was all she had left of value, but even it had been stolen weeks ago, probably by drifters passing through. As she walked through town, she noticed how people stepped aside, how conversations stopped when she passed. The minister's wife crossed the street to avoid her. The blacksmith's daughter was pulled inside when Margaret walked by. She had become a pariah, a reminder of what happened to those who ventured too far, who challenged the natural order of things. At the edge of town, she paused by the saloon, steeling herself. The washing she took in from the working girls there was her only income now, but each time she entered, she felt another piece of her respectability slip away. Maggie, Ruby, one of the younger girls, waved her over. "We've got 3 baskets ready for you." Margaret collected the laundry, trying not to see the pity in Ruby's painted eyes. As she struggled with the heavy baskets, a shadow fell across her path. Jake Morrison, the town's self-appointed moral guardian and owner of the largest ranch in the county, blocked her way. "This is what you've been reduced to, Margaret?" His voice was oily with false concern. "Your husband would be spinning in his grave." "My husband is beyond caring, Mr. Morrison. Now, if you'll excuse me, you know." He moved closer, his breath sour with whiskey despite the early hour. "A woman like you needs protection. I could help, if you were amenable." Margaret's skin crawled. "I need no protection, thank you. Every woman needs protection out here, especially with those savages still roaming free. They killed your husband. After all, who knows what they might do to a lone woman?" His hand reached out to touch her arm. She jerked away. "Good day, Mr. Morrison." His face darkened. "You'd best think carefully about your position, Mrs. Sullivan. Winter's coming, and pride makes for a cold bedfellow." That night, as Margaret bent over the washboard, her hands raw from lye soap, she thought about Thomas's dreams. He'd wanted to build an empire out here, to have sons who would inherit vast stretches of land. Instead, he'd left her with nothing but debt and a reputation in tatters. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose boards of her house. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild. Margaret paused in her work, suddenly overwhelmed by the vastness of the land around her, the indifference of it. The frontier didn't care about her vows or her grief. It simply existed, waiting to swallow anyone who showed weakness. She remembered the day they'd arrived in Bitter Creek, full of hope. Thomas had lifted her down from the wagon, spinning her around until she was dizzy with laughter. "This is it, Maggie," he'd said. "This is where we'll build our future." Now, as she returned to her washing, Margaret wondered if the frontier had ever intended to let them build anything at all. Perhaps it had always planned to take everything from them, leaving only shadows and dust and the bitter taste of promises that could never be kept. The words of her vow echoed in the empty house. "I will never let one of those savages touch me." But as she looked around at her isolation, at the way her own people had cast her aside, she wondered who the real savages were. The warriors who had killed to defend their land, or the townspeople who were slowly killing her with their righteous cruelty. Outside, the wind continued its endless conversation with the emptiness, and Margaret Sullivan continued her work, her hands moving mechanically while her mind wandered through the wasteland of what her life had become. Tomorrow would bring new humiliations, new struggles, but tonight she had laundry to finish and a vow to keep, even as the very keeping of it seemed to be destroying her from within. The candle flickered in the draft, casting dancing shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to mock the woman she had once been and the bitter creature she was becoming. In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, promising a storm that might bring relief from the drought, or might simply turn the dust to mud and make everything that much harder to bear. Such was life in Bitter Creek, where hope died as fast as the grass in summer, and where a woman's vow could become both her anchor and her chain. The October sun was already harsh despite the early hour as Margaret Sullivan guided her rickety wagon along the dusty trail outside Bitter Creek. She'd borrowed the wagon from old Pete at the livery, promising to have it back by noon. The laundry she'd delivered to the ranch hands at the Morrison spread had earned her enough for a few supplies, and she was determined to check the old Turner homestead for anything salvageable before the bank claimed it. The abandoned property lay 5 miles from town, and Margaret knew the risk of traveling alone. But desperation had a way of making people foolish, and the thought of finding preserved goods or tools she could sell overcame her caution. Thomas would have forbidden such a journey, but Thomas was 6 months in the ground, and his protective instincts had died with him. The trail wound through a grove of cottonwoods, their leaves already turning gold. Margaret was so focused on navigating the rutted path that she didn't hear the horses until they were nearly upon her. 3 riders emerged from the trees, their faces covered with bandanas, their intentions clear in the way they spread out to block her path. "Well, well," the lead rider said, his voice muffled but unmistakably coarse. "What's a pretty widow doing all alone out here?" Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "Let me pass. I have nothing of value." "Now that ain't entirely true," another rider said, moving his horse closer. "That wagon might fetch a few dollars. And that dress, well, it's been a while since we've seen such fine fabric." The third rider, younger than the others by his build, fidgeted in his saddle. "Cole, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Billy," Cole snapped. He dismounted, approaching Margaret's wagon with the casual confidence of a man who'd done this before. "Step down, ma'am. Nice and easy." Margaret's hands shook as she reached under the wagon seat for Thomas's old pistol, but Cole was faster. He grabbed her wrist, yanking her from the wagon with such force that she sprawled in the dust. The pistol skittered away. Useless. "Please," she gasped, struggling to her knees. "I'm a widow. I have nothing—" "You've got more than you think," Cole said, reaching for her. The arrow came without warning, striking Cole's shoulder with a wet thud. He screamed, spinning around as a figure emerged from the rocks above. A native warrior, tall and lean, with long black hair tied back and paint across his cheekbones. He held a bow, another arrow already knocked. "Indians!" Billy yelled, wheeling his horse around. The warrior moved with fluid grace, his second arrow catching the third rider in the thigh. The wounded men scrambled for their horses, Cole clutching his bleeding shoulder as Billy helped him mount. They fled in a cloud of dust, leaving Margaret trembling on the ground. She looked up at her savior, terror replacing one fear with another. This was what she'd sworn against, the touch of a savage, the very people who'd killed Thomas. The warrior descended from the rocks, moving toward her with measured steps. Margaret scrambled backward, her hands scraping against stones. "No," she whispered. "Stay back." The warrior stopped, studying her with dark eyes that seemed to see through her fear to something deeper. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 summers, with a scar running along his jaw. His chest was bare save for a bone breastplate, and his leggings were decorated with beadwork. Everything about him spoke of the wilderness, of a life lived beyond the boundaries of her world. He said something in his own language, his voice low and calm. When she didn't respond, he gestured to her wagon, then to the direction of town. The message was clear. She should leave. Margaret struggled to her feet, her legs unsteady. The warrior made no move to help or hinder her. He simply watched as she climbed back onto the wagon, his expression unreadable. As she gathered the reins, he raised his hand to the horizon, a gesture she didn't understand but somehow felt was meant as guidance. She drove the wagon as fast as she dared, not looking back until she reached the safety of Bitter Creek's main street. Only then did she allow herself to shake, great trembling waves that made her teeth chatter despite the heat. At the livery, old Pete took one look at her dust-covered dress and pale face. "Lord Almighty, Mrs. Sullivan, what happened?" "Bandits," she managed. "On the Turner Road." "Bandits?" His eyes widened. "How did you—" They left. Decided I wasn't worth the trouble." The lie came easily. She couldn't speak the truth, couldn't admit that one of those savages had saved her life. Word had spread quickly, as it always did in Bitter Creek. By evening, versions of the story were circulating through the saloons and parlors. Some said she'd fought off the bandits herself. Others whispered that she'd made a deal with them, trading her virtue for her life. But Sarah Chen, the banker's daughter, had been riding with her father that afternoon and claimed to have seen Margaret's wagon racing back to town with arrows stuck in its side. Indian arrows. She's consorting with them, Mrs. Hutchinson declared at the church auxiliary meeting. Mark my words, that woman is bringing danger to our very doorsteps. Jake Morrison was more direct when he cornered Margaret outside the general store 2 days later. Heard you had some trouble on the Turner Road. It's been dealt with, Mr. Morrison. Has it? His eyes narrowed. Billy Hicks is drinking himself stupid at the saloon, babbling about an Indian who appeared out of nowhere. Says the savage was protecting you. Margaret kept her face carefully neutral. Mr. Hicks must have been drinking before the attempted robbery as well. I saw no Indians. That's so. Morrison stepped closer. Because Billy's got an arrow wound that says otherwise, and Cole Winters hasn't been seen since that day. Some might wonder if you've made some sort of arrangement with those heathens. Some might wonder many things, Margaret said coldly. That doesn't make them true. But the damage was done. The whispers grew louder. Margaret Sullivan, the widow who took in whore's laundry, was now the widow who consorted with savages. Mothers pulled their children inside when she passed. The minister informed her that her presence at Sunday services was disruptive to the congregation's spiritual wellness. A week after the incident, Margaret found a bundle on her doorstep, fresh venison wrapped in hide, along with a small pouch of wild herbs. No note, no sign of who had left it. But she knew. As she cooked the meat that night, her first real meal in days, she thought about dark eyes that had looked at her without judgment, about a hand raised to the horizon in what might have been blessing or warning. She ate alone in her small house, the candle flickering in the draught. Outside, the October wind was picking up, winter's first herald. As she finished her meal, Margaret found herself thinking not of Thomas or her vow, but of a scar along a strong jaw and arrows that flew truer than any justice she'd found in Bitter Creek. I will never let one of those savages touch me, she whispered to the empty room. But he hadn't touched her. Had he? He'd simply stood there, allowing her fear to keep its distance, while his actions spoke of a humanity that her own kind seemed to have forgotten. That night, she dreamed of arrows and dust and eyes that saw too much. When she woke, the bundle's wrapping was still on her table, a tangible reminder that the world was more complex than the simple hatred she'd wrapped around herself like a shawl. In saving her, the warrior had done more than preserve her life. He'd cracked the foundation of everything she thought she knew. But still, she told herself as dawn broke over Bitter Creek, he was one of them, one of the savages who'd taken Thomas from her. The fact that he'd shown her mercy changed nothing, nothing at all. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing winds that cut through clothing like knives and snow that fell in thick, suffocating blankets. Margaret Sullivan pulled her thin shawl tighter as she stood outside the boarding house that had been her home for the past 3 months. Mrs. Hutchinson had finally made good on her threat, and now even this meager shelter was being denied her. I'm sorry, Mrs. Sullivan, the proprietor said, not meeting her eyes. But the other boarders are uncomfortable. They say you bring bad luck, that you're marked somehow. After what happened with the Morrison Ranch, Margaret didn't need him to finish. 2 weeks ago, Jake Morrison's prize cattle had been found slaughtered, and though there was no evidence linking her to the incident, the timing was suspect. Morrison had been pressing his suit more aggressively, and she'd continued to refuse. Now the town had another reason to shun her. I understand, she said quietly, though understanding and accepting were two different things. She gathered her few possessions, Thomas's Bible, a daguerreotype of their wedding day, the clothes that hung looser on her frame with each passing week, and loaded them onto a borrowed handcart. The sun was already low in the sky, and she had nowhere to go. The abandoned shack on the edge of town was her only option, a ramshackle structure that barely kept out the wind. But as she struggled through the snow, the cart's wheels catching in the drifts, exhaustion overwhelmed her. The world spun, her vision darkening at the edges. Hunger, cold, and despair finally claimed their due. Margaret Sullivan collapsed into the snow, her last thought a bitter acknowledgement that this was how her story would end, alone, frozen, forgotten. She woke to warmth and the smell of sage smoke. For a moment, Margaret thought she had died and somehow found her way to a place of comfort. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw buffalo hides overhead, supported by wooden poles. A fire crackled in the center of the space, its smoke rising through a hole above. She was in a teepee. Panic seized her. She tried to sit up, but her body was weak, wrapped in soft furs that smelled of cedar and earth. As she struggled, a figure entered through the entrance flap, the warrior who had saved her from the bandits. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "No, I can't be here." He approached slowly, carrying a wooden bowl that steamed in the cold air. His face was as she remembered, angular, scarred, with eyes that held depth she didn't want to explore. He wore winter clothing now, buckskin and fur that made him seem even more foreign to her world. He spoke in his language, gesturing to the bowl. When she shook her head, he set it down near the fire and retreated to the far side of the teepee, giving her space. The message was clear: eat or don't, stay or go. The choice was hers. But what choice did she really have? Outside, she could hear the wind howling, could see through the entrance flap that snow was falling heavily. She was miles from town, weak from hunger and cold. Pride wouldn't keep her alive. Margaret reached for the bowl with trembling hands. The broth was rich, flavored with herbs she didn't recognize, and as it warmed her from within, tears began to fall. She was in the dwelling of a savage, breaking every promise she'd made to herself and to Thomas's memory. The warrior, she couldn't think of him by any other name, watched her eat without comment. When she finished, he took the bowl and left the teepee, returning with more food: dried meat, flatbread, and a tea that tasted of pine. He moved around the space with quiet efficiency, tending the fire, checking the hide walls for gaps where cold might enter. Days passed in a blur of fever and recovery. Margaret slipped in and out of consciousness, sometimes waking to find the warrior applying poultices to her frostbitten fingers, other times finding herself alone with only the fire for company. He never touched her more than necessary for her care, never spoke except in his own language, which she began to recognize had a musical quality beneath its unfamiliar sounds. When her fever finally broke, she found herself truly aware for the first time. The teepee was larger than she'd realized, with painted symbols on the interior and various tools and weapons hung from the poles. Everything was organized with a precision that surprised her. She'd always heard that Indians lived in squalor, but this space was cleaner than many homes in Bitter Creek. The warrior entered as she was examining a beaded pouch, and she quickly set it down, embarrassed to be caught snooping. He studied her for a moment, then moved to a painted parfleche and removed something wrapped in soft leather. He handed it to her, gesturing that she should open it. Inside was a photograph, a tintype of a native woman holding a baby, both dressed in a mixture of traditional clothing and white settlers' garments. The woman's face was serene, beautiful, but there was something about her eyes that spoke of sadness. The warrior pointed to the photograph, then to himself, then made a cutting motion across his throat. His meaning was clear. This had been his family, and they were dead. He pointed outside, toward where Bitter Creek would be, and she understood. His family had died in violence with white settlers, just as Thomas had died in violence with his people. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, the words inadequate but all she had. He took the photograph back carefully, rewrapping it with gentle hands. Then he pointed to her, making a questioning gesture. After a moment, She understood and reached for her own meager possessions, finding the daguerreotype of her wedding day. She handed it to him, watching as he examined the image of her younger self, radiant in white beside Thomas in his best suit. He pointed to Thomas, then made the same cutting motion. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They sat in silence for a while. Two people bound by loss, separated by everything else. That night, as she lay in the warm furs listening to the wind howl outside, Margaret found herself thinking about the town that had cast her out. They would say she had fallen completely now, sharing a dwelling with a savage. But here in this tipi, she had found more kindness than in all her months of widowhood in Bitter Creek. The warrior asked nothing of her, took nothing from her. He simply ensured she lived. When she woke the next morning, she found him crafting arrows by the fire, his movements precise and practiced. She watched, fascinated despite herself, as he selected each shaft, tested its straightness, and carefully attached the fletching. These were tools of death, like the ones that had killed Thomas. Yet, in his hands, they seemed more like art than weapons. He noticed her watching and held up a completed arrow, showing her the intricate work. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled, just slightly, and she saw in that moment not a savage, but a man, one who had chosen to save her enemy's widow for reasons she couldn't fathom. "Why?" she asked, knowing he wouldn't understand the word but hoping he might grasp the question. He was quiet for a long moment, then spoke in broken English, the words heavily accented but understandable. "You, same as me, alone, winter, no good for alone." It was the first time she'd heard him speak her language, and it changed everything. If he could speak English, even poorly, then he had made efforts to understand her world, just as she was now, unwillingly, beginning to understand his, "What's your name?" she asked. "Joseph," he said, and she realized it must be a name given by missionaries or traders, not his true name. "But my people, they call me—" He said something in his language that sounded like flowing water. "Joseph," she repeated, because it was easier, and because giving him an English name made him seem less foreign, less dangerous. He pointed to her. "Margaret," she said. He nodded, repeating it carefully. "Margaret." Outside, the storm continued to rage, and Margaret knew she should feel trapped, terrified. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Safe. It was a bitter irony that she should find security in the dwelling of one she'd sworn to hate. But the heart, she was learning, paid little attention to vows made in grief. As Joseph returned to his arrow-making and she huddled deeper into the furs, Margaret realized that her world had shifted in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. The enemy had shown her mercy, had given her shelter and warmth when her own people had turned away. The savage had proved more civilized than civilization itself, and somewhere deep inside, in a place she didn't want to acknowledge, she felt the first stirrings of something that frightened her more than death: gratitude. The days that followed blurred together like watercolors in rain. Margaret watched Joseph's daily routine with growing fascination, the pre-dawn prayers he offered to the east, the careful way he rationed their food, the patience with which he repaired tools and weapons. She had expected savagery and found instead a discipline that put most townsmen to shame. On her fourth day of consciousness, she insisted on helping with small tasks. Joseph showed her how to tend the fire properly, how to bank it for the night so warmth would last until morning. He demonstrated the art of making pemmican, mixing dried meat with berries and fat to create a food that would sustain them through the harsh winter. His hands moved with practiced grace, and she found herself mesmerized by their gentle efficiency. "Your people," she ventured one evening as they worked side by side. "Where are they?" Joseph's face darkened. "Gone. Soldiers come. Say we must move. Some go to reservation. Some fight. Many die." He gestured toward the photograph of his wife and child. "Sickness take them on the walking. Bad water. Bad food." Margaret felt the familiar sting of tears. "The reservation, that's where they wanted you to go?" He nodded. "Like prison. No hunt. No move with seasons. Wait for government food that may become, maybe not. Children forget the old ways. Warriors become beggars. She thought of her own imprisonment in Bitter Creek. Different in form, but similar in essence. The slow starvation, the loss of dignity, the forgetting of who she had been. Why didn't you go? My woman say, before she die, live free or die free, but do not die in cage. He touched his chest. I keep promise. That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about promises, the ones we keep, the ones that keep us. Her vow to never let a savage touch her seemed childish now, born of grief and ignorance. This man had touched her only to save her life, had shown her more respect than Jake Morrison with all his claims to Christian virtue. The next morning brought weak sunlight and a break in the storms. Joseph announced they would check his trap lines, and when Margaret moved to stay behind, he shook his head. You come, learn. She followed him through snow that came to her knees, marveling at how he found his way when everything looked identical to her. White earth, white sky, dark skeletal trees. He showed her how to read animal tracks, how to spot the subtle signs of a trap's location. When they found a rabbit caught in a snare, he dispatched it quickly and quietly, offering words in his language that sounded like gratitude. We thank the rabbit spirit, he explained. Take only what need, give thanks for life given. Margaret thought of the waste she'd seen in Bitter Creek, cattle slaughtered for prime cuts while the rest rotted, buffalo killed for tongues and hides while mountains of meat spoiled on the plains. We don't do that, she said quietly. My people, we just take... Joseph studied her. Not all white people same, you different. How am I different? You see with clear eyes now, before eyes clouded with hate, now. He gestured to her face. Now you beginning to see. They returned to find visitors at the teepee. 3 native women, bundled against the cold. They spoke rapidly to Joseph in their language, gesturing toward Margaret with expressions of curiosity and concern. She stood awkwardly, aware of how she must look in her tattered dress and borrowed blanket. One of the women, elderly, with a face mapped by years of sun and wind, approached Margaret. She touched Margaret's hair, so different from her own, then spoke to Joseph at length. He translated haltingly. She says you have sad spirit, lost like young bird fallen from nest. The old woman pressed something into Margaret's hands, a pair of fur-lined moccasins. Margaret tried to refuse, but the woman insisted, patting her arm with unexpected gentleness. The other women produced more gifts, a warmer dress made of soft doe skin, leggings, a proper winter cloak. They fussed over her like mothers, clicking their tongues at her thinness, her pale skin, her clumsy attempts to thank them in signs. After they left, Margaret held the clothing, overwhelmed. Why would they help me? I'm white. My people have done terrible things to them. Winter is enemy to all, Joseph said simply. In winter, we help who needs help. This is the way. She changed into the native clothing, feeling strange but undeniably warmer. The doe skin was soft against her skin, the moccasins like walking on clouds compared to her worn boots. When she emerged from behind the privacy screen Joseph had erected, she caught something in his eyes. Approval? Appreciation? It was gone too quickly to tell. That evening, he began teaching her words in his language. Simple things at first: water, fire, food, cold. She struggled with the unfamiliar sounds, but he was patient, repeating each word until she could approximate it. When she finally managed to say, "Thank you," correctly, his rare smile appeared again. You learn quick, he said. Like my woman, she learned English fast. Try to make bridge between worlds. What happened to her wasn't sickness, was it? Margaret asked gently. His face closed off, and she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, soldiers come to move us. She tried to talk, make peace. She speak both languages. They should listen. But young soldier, Joseph touched his chest where a heart would be. He gets scared. Shoot. Then shooting everywhere. Margaret reached out instinctively, touching his arm. He didn't pull away, but she felt the tension in his muscles, the control it took not to retreat from even this small comfort. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing how inadequate it was. "I'm so sorry. Sorry not bring them back," he said. "But maybe—" He looked at her, something vulnerable in his dark eyes. Maybe understanding make future different. That night, she helped prepare their meal, moving around the teepee with growing confidence. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, wolves howled in the distance, but inside felt safe, warm, almost like— No, she couldn't think the word. This wasn't home. This was temporary shelter, nothing more. When spring came, she would have to leave, have to find somewhere else to go. But as she watched Joseph bank the fire for the night, his movements economic and graceful, she wondered where else there was for someone like her, too damaged for white society, too white for his world. "Margaret," he said suddenly, "your man, he was good man?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Thomas was kind, gentle. He wanted to build something here, make a life. He never wanted to hurt anyone. Then I am sorry for his death," Joseph said formally. "War makes enemies of men who might be friends." She felt tears threaten again. Do you think they could have been? Friends? Joseph considered this. Good hearts find way to each other, even across great water. But fear make water wider, until no bridge can cross. Margaret thought about fear, how it had consumed her after Thomas's death, how it had built walls around her heart that only desperation had finally breached. She looked at Joseph, really looked at him, and saw not the savage of her nightmares, but a man who had lost as much as she had, who chose compassion over vengeance. "I was afraid of you," she admitted. "Terrified? I swore I'd never—" "I know," he said quietly. "I see it in your eyes. That first day, same fear I see in soldiers' eyes before they shoot. But you—" He paused, searching for words. "You let fear go. This take courage. I had no choice," she said. "Always choice. You could choose die instead of accept help from enemy. Many would." He gestured to the teepee. The fire, the evidence of two lives temporarily intertwined. "You choose life. This honor Thomas' memory better than hate." Margaret hadn't thought of it that way. Would Thomas want her to die for the sake of a vow made in grief? Or would he want her to live, even if it meant accepting help from unexpected sources? She thought she knew the answer, and it eased something in her chest that had been twisted tight for months. As she settled into her furs for the night, she realized that the face of the enemy had changed. It was no longer painted in war colors, fierce and terrifying. Instead, it was scarred and weathered, with eyes that held pain and wisdom in equal measure. It was the face of someone who had chosen to save her when he had every reason to let her die. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She was learning that survival here required more than food and warmth. It required adapting, changing, becoming someone she never thought she'd be. The Margaret who had stood at Thomas's graveside would be horrified to see her now, dressed in doeskin and learning words in the language of his killers. But that Margaret had been dying slowly in Bitter Creek, crushed by the weight of her vow and the cruelty of her own people. This Margaret, strange as it seemed, was learning to live again. The first signs of spring came slowly, patches of brown earth showing through melting snow, the distant sound of geese returning north, and a restlessness in Margaret that she couldn't quite name. She had survived the winter, learned to move through Joseph's world with increasing confidence. But now the thought of returning to Bitter Creek filled her with dread. "I should go back," she said one morning as they watched the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold. "The roads will be clear soon." Joseph was quiet for a long moment. "You want go back?" "Want?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "No, but where else is there?" "Many places," he said. "World bigger than one town." But she knew the truth. A woman alone, with no money and a reputation in ruins, had few options anywhere. Still, she couldn't stay here forever, living on Joseph's charity, existing in this strange liminal space between worlds. That afternoon, She made the journey back to Bitter Creek. Joseph had offered to accompany her, but she'd refused, needing to face this alone. She wore her old dress, carefully mended, though she kept the moccasins. Her boots had finally fallen apart completely. The town looked smaller than she remembered, dirtier. Mud season had arrived, turning Main Street into a river of muck. She made her way to the general store, hoping to find some work, some way to start again. The moment she entered, conversation stopped. Mrs. Henderson looked at her as if seeing a ghost. "Margaret Sullivan, we thought you were dead." "As you can see, I'm not. Where have you been all winter?" The question came from Mrs. Hutchinson, sharp as always. "You disappeared in that blizzard. Jake Morrison organized search parties. I found shelter," Margaret said carefully. "Shelter where?" Mrs. Hutchinson's eyes narrowed. "With whom?" Before Margaret could answer, Jake Morrison himself pushed through the crowd that was gathering. His face was florid with drink despite the early hour, and his eyes held a mean glint she recognized too well. Well, the widow returns." He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the moccasins. "And wearing Indian footwear. I see. That answers the question of where you've been. Mr. Morrison, you've been living with them, haven't you?" His voice rose. "Living with the savages who killed your husband. Have you no shame?" The crowd murmured, ugly sounds that promised uglier actions. Margaret lifted her chin. "I survived the winter. That's all that matters." "Survived?" Morrison laughed harshly. "Is that what you call it? Whoring yourself to those animals?" The slap came before Margaret realized she'd moved, her hand connecting with Morrison's face with a crack that echoed through the store. For a moment, there was perfect silence. Then Morrison grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "You'll regret that, woman. Let her go." The voice came from the doorway. Ruby, the saloon girl, stood there with two of her colleagues. "Let her go, Morrison, or every man in this town will know exactly what you like to do in the back rooms, including your wife." Morrison's face went from red to white. He released Margaret's arm, but his eyes promised retribution. "This isn't over." Ruby guided Margaret outside, her painted face kind. "You can't stay here, honey. They'll make your life hell." "It's already hell," Margaret said quietly. "No, you don't understand. Morrison's been telling everyone you led those Indians to his cattle, that you're in league with them. He's got the town worked up. There's talk of making an example." Margaret felt cold despite the spring warmth. "An example? The kind that involves rope," Ruby said bluntly. "You need to leave. Tonight." But Margaret had nowhere to go and no money to get there. She thanked Ruby and walked through town, feeling the weight of hostile stares. At the cemetery, she knelt by Thomas's grave, the wooden marker already weathering. "I tried," she whispered. "I tried to keep my promise, to hate them like you would want. But Thomas, he saved me. One of them saved me when our own people left me to die." "What am I supposed to do with that?" The grave offered no answers. She stayed until sunset, then made her way to the abandoned shack at the edge of town. It was there that Morrison found her, along with 5 other men, their intentions clear in their faces and the rope one carried. "Time to pay for your sins. Widow Sullivan," Morrison said. "Consorting with the enemy, leading them to Christian property. That's treason in my book." "You have no proof of anything," Margaret said, backing against the wall. "Don't need proof. Your own actions condemn you." He nodded to the men. "Take her." They grabbed her roughly, binding her hands. She fought, screaming, but there was no one to hear, no one who would care if they did. They dragged her toward a large cottonwood tree, its branches perfect for their purpose. The arrow came out of nowhere, striking the rope from the man's hand. Joseph emerged from the darkness like an avenging spirit. Another arrow already knocked. Behind him, 2 other warriors appeared, their face painted for war. "Let woman go," Joseph said. his English clear despite his accent. "Now!" The white men scrambled for their guns, but the warriors were faster. Arrows flew, wounding but not killing, designed to disable rather than destroy. Morrison tried to run, but Joseph was on him in seconds, knife at his throat. "You," Joseph said coldly. "You hurt many women. Ruby tell truth. She send word to me. This stop now? You can't do this." Morrison gasped. "The army will come. They'll wipe out every last one of you." "Maybe," Joseph said. "But you not live to see." He pressed the knife harder, drawing a thin line of blood. "No." Margaret struggled against her bonds. "Joseph, no. Don't become what they think you are." Joseph met her eyes, and she saw the war within him, vengeance against mercy, justice against wisdom. Finally, he stepped back, shoving Morrison to the ground. "You leave. All of you. Tell others. Margaret Sullivan under my protection. Anyone hurt her? Answer to me." The men fled, Morrison clutching his bleeding throat. Joseph cut Margaret's bonds, his hands gentle despite the violence of moments before. "You hurt!" She shook her head, then found herself sobbing, the terror and relief overwhelming. Joseph stood awkwardly, clearly unsure whether to comfort her. Finally, she leaned against him, and after a moment, his arms came around her. "Careful and protective. Cannot stay here," he said quietly. "They come back with many guns." "I know." She pulled back, wiping her tears. "I have nowhere else to go." "Yes, you do." He met her eyes. "Come with me. Not to winter camp. Too dangerous now. Other place. Trading post. 2 days north. Man there. Jacques Dubois. He married to Lakota woman. They understand both worlds. You safe there." Margaret looked back at Bitter Creek, at the life she'd tried so hard to cling to despite its rejection of her. Then she looked at Joseph, this man who'd repeatedly saved her, who'd shown more honor than any civilized man she knew. "All right," she said. "I'll come." They left that night, Joseph's warrior companions disappearing into the darkness while he led Margaret north. As they walked, he told her about the trading post, about possibilities she'd never considered, places where the rigid lines between white and native blurred, where survival mattered more than skin color. "Why?" she asked as they paused to rest. "Why do you keep saving me?" Joseph was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "First time on road, you just woman needing help. Any warrior would same do, but winter." He paused, choosing words carefully. "You show courage, learn our ways, not with hate but with open heart. My woman would say you have good spirit, just lost for time. And now?" He looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Now, you not stranger, you Margaret, you—" He touched his chest. "You important." The word hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to explore. They resumed walking, but something had shifted. The rescue hadn't been obligation or chance. It had been choice, personal and deliberate. As dawn broke, Margaret looked back one last time at the life she was leaving behind. The widow who'd sworn never to touch a savage was gone. In her place walked a woman who'd learned that humanity and inhumanity existed in all peoples. That survival sometimes meant releasing the very vows that defined us. She thought of Thomas and hoped he would understand. Love had died with him on that frontier trail. But life, complicated, unexpected, possibly even hopeful life, was calling her forward. And despite everything she'd believed, everything she'd sworn, she found herself ready to answer. The trading post sat at the confluence of 2 rivers, a collection of log buildings that seemed to grow from the earth itself. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and Margaret could hear the mix of languages, French, English, Lakota, Cheyenne, that marked this as a true crossroads. Joseph had barely spoken during their 2-day journey, but she'd felt his protective presence, the way he'd chosen easier paths for her feet, shared his water without being asked. Jacques Dubois was a large man with a gray-streaked beard and eyes that missed nothing. His wife, Morning Star, was a handsome woman whose bearing spoke of quiet strength, They welcomed Joseph with familiarity and Margaret with cautious courtesy. "Joseph says you need safe place," Jacques said in accented English. "You stay, work. We have room." Margaret found herself in a small but clean room behind the trading post, the first private space she'd had in months. That night, she sat on the narrow bed and wept. For Thomas, for the life she'd lost, for the strange path that had led her here. Days became weeks. Margaret worked in the trading post, learning to negotiate between worlds as Jacques and Morningstar did daily. Trappers, soldiers, native hunters, settlers, all came through, and she watched how the couple navigated the complexities, never fully one thing or another, but something unique and resilient. Joseph came and went, bringing furs to trade, staying a night or two before disappearing again. Each time he arrived, Margaret felt her heart skip, a feeling that filled her with guilt and confusion. This was the enemy. Her mind insisted, but her heart had stopped listening to such simple categories. One evening, as she helped Morningstar prepare a meal, the older woman spoke quietly. "You care for him." I can't," Margaret said. "My husband is dead," Morningstar said gently but firmly. "The dead want us to live, not die with them. But Joseph's people killed Thomas. How can I? My people killed Jacques' brother in battle." Morningstar interrupted. "His people killed my uncle. We could spend our lives counting the dead, or we can choose to count the living." She touched Margaret's hand. "The heart doesn't understand war. It only understands what it feels." That night, Joseph appeared at the kitchen door, a fresh deer over his shoulders, as Margaret helped him dress the meat, working side by side in comfortable rhythm. She felt the truth of Morningstar's words. Her heart had made its choice, regardless of what her mind believed. "Stay longer this time," she said quietly as they worked. He looked at her, surprised. "You want?" "Yes," she said simply. "I want." But the peace couldn't last. A week later, a cavalry unit arrived at the trading post. The lieutenant, a young man with cold eyes, announced they were looking for renegade Indians who'd attacked white settlers near Bitter Creek. "There was no attack," Margaret said before she could stop herself. "I was there. They were defending—" "And you are?" The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. Jacques intervened smoothly. "My employee, Lieutenant, she helps with the books." But one of the soldiers, a private from Bitter Creek, recognized her. "That's the Sullivan widow, the one who took up with the savages. She's probably hiding them right now." The search was thorough and fruitless. Joseph had melted into the forest at the first sign of cavalry. But the damage was done. The lieutenant left men to watch the post, making it clear that any renegades would be shot on sight. "You can't stay," Jacques told Margaret that night. "They'll use you as bait, or worse. There's a wagon train heading to Oregon Territory next week. I can get you passage." "I can't leave," Margaret protested. This has become home." "Home is where you're alive," Morningstar said pragmatically. "Joseph will find you again if it's meant to be." But Margaret couldn't imagine starting over yet again, couldn't bear the thought of never seeing Joseph again. She went about her work mechanically, her heart heavy. 3 nights before the wagon train was to leave, Joseph appeared in her room like a shadow. "You go Oregon?" he asked without preamble. "I don't want to," she whispered, aware of the soldiers outside. "But what choice do I have?" "Come with me," he said urgently. "My mother's people, far north, safe there. Hard life, but free life." "Joseph?" She touched his face, feeling the roughness of his scarred jaw. "I'm white. They'll never accept me. You learn our ways. You strong. They see, in time." He caught her hand, pressing it to his chest where his heart beat fast. "I not let you go alone again. Where you go, I go. This I promise." "What are you saying?" "I saying." He struggled with the English, then spoke in his own language, the words flowing like water. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, the look in his eyes. "I don't even know your real name." she said, tears starting to fall. He spoke it then, the syllables that sounded like wind through pine trees. Means he who stands between. My grandfather say I would stand between worlds someday. He right. Margaret made her choice then, the same choice she'd been making in small ways since the day he'd first saved her. I'll come with you. They left that night, slipping past the soldiers with Morningstar's help. As they vanished into the forest, Margaret looked back once at the trading post, at this place that had been a bridge between her old life and whatever came next. Afraid? Joseph asked as they paused to rest. Terrified, she admitted. But not of you, not anymore. What afraid of? She considered. Of losing myself. Of becoming someone Thomas wouldn't recognize. Joseph was quiet for a moment. Maybe not lose. Maybe find Margaret, who is more than widow, more than white woman, more than promise made in sadness. He touched her cheek gently. Find Margaret who chooses life. They traveled north through forests, coming alive with spring. At night, they slept apart but close, the tension between them growing with each passing day. Margaret found herself watching him, the economical grace of his movements, the way he read the forest like a book, the unexpected gentleness in his hands. One evening, as they camped by a clear stream, she finally voiced what had been haunting her. I swore I'd never let one of your people touch me. It was the only thing that kept me standing at Thomas's grave. You keep promise, Joseph said quietly. I never touch without permission. But I want... She stopped, unable to finish. What you want? Margaret looked at him across the fire. This man who'd saved her again and again, who'd shown her that enemy was just a word, not a truth. I want to let go of that promise. I want to choose something else. Choose you. Joseph moved then, coming around the fire to kneel beside her. Margaret, you sure? Not gratitude, not lonely. Sure. She touched his face, tracing the scar she'd once found so frightening. I'm sure. Thomas is gone, and I'll always love who he was. But you brought me back to life. How can I not love that? Love? The word hung between them, heavy with possibility. Love, she confirmed, surprising herself with the certainty. Different from what I had with Thomas, but no less real. Joseph kissed her then, gentle and careful, as if she might break or flee. When they parted, he spoke in his own language again, then translated. I say you are my heart's home. Where you are, I am whole. They held each other as the fire died to embers. Two people who should have been enemies choosing instead to be something else entirely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, his people to convince, her past to fully release, a future to build in a world that had no place for their kind of love. But tonight, there was just this, the stream singing over stones, the stars wheeling overhead, and two hearts finding their way to each other across a chasm of loss and prejudice. Margaret's vow lay broken at her feet, but in its place grew something stronger, the choice to live, to love, to become more than tragedy had tried to make her. No more looking back, she whispered against his chest. No, he agreed, only forward now. And in that moment, with spring arriving and new life stirring in the forest around them, Margaret Sullivan felt the last chains of her old life fall away. The widow was gone. In her place was simply a woman who had chosen love over hate, life over death, and a future with a man who had shown her that salvation could come from the most unexpected places. The enemy had become her hope. Her hope had become her heart, and her heart, against all odds and oaths, had found its home. The news reached them at a small settlement 3 days north. Bitter Creek was in uproar. Jake Morrison had returned with tales of savage attacks, claiming Margaret Sullivan had led a war party to his ranch. The army was mobilizing, bounties were being offered, and vigilante groups were forming to hunt down any Indians they could find. We must go back, Joseph said after hearing the trader's account. My people in danger because of me, because of us, Margaret corrected. I won't let you face this alone. They argued through the night, Joseph insisting she continue north to safety, Margaret refusing to abandon him. Finally, As dawn broke, she ended the debate with simple truth. You stood between me and death. Now I stand with you. This is what love does. They returned by hidden paths, reaching the outskirts of Bitter Creek as storm clouds gathered. The town was a powder keg. Armed men patrolled the streets. Torches burned despite the daylight, and angry voices carried on the wind. Margaret had never seen such organized hatred, such hunger for violence. At the trading post, they found Jacques and Morningstar preparing to leave. They burned out the Hendersons' place. Jacques explained grimly, said they were Indian sympathizers for trading with the tribes. You two need to disappear, now. No, Margaret said firmly. Running only confirms their lies. I need to tell the truth. The truth? Morningstar shook her head. They don't want truth, they want blood. But Margaret had made up her mind. That evening, as the town gathered for a meeting to organize hunting parties, she walked into the church. Joseph followed, despite her pleas for him to stay hidden. The reaction was immediate. Shouts, curses, men reaching for guns. Listen to me, Margaret shouted above the chaos. Everything Morrison told you is a lie. Grab her, Morrison bellowed. She's a traitor and a savage lover. But Ruby and several saloon girls formed a protective circle around Margaret. Let her speak, Ruby demanded. Or does this town only listen to the voices of rich men and liars? The minister, Reverend Carlyle, raised his hands for order. This is God's house. Let her speak. Then we'll decide. Margaret stood straight, finding strength in Joseph's presence behind her. Jake Morrison tried to force himself on me. When I refused, he tried to have me hanged. Joseph, this man you call savage, saved my life. Not once, but 3 times. He showed me kindness when this Christian town showed me only cruelty. Lies, Morrison snarled. She's bewitched, corrupted by heathen ways. Then let's have the whole truth, Ruby said loudly. Tell them about your visits to us. Morrison, tell them what you really do with your Christian charity. Morrison's wife, silent until now, stood slowly. I want to hear more, she said quietly, her voice carrying surprising authority. Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. I lived among Joseph's people this winter. I expected savagery and found civilization. I expected cruelty and found compassion. They took me in when I was dying, asked nothing in return, treated me with more respect than I ever found here. She admits it, someone shouted. She chose them over us. I chose life over death. Margaret replied, I chose truth over comfortable lies, and yes, I chose love over hate. The room erupted. In the chaos, someone fired a gun. Joseph moved instantly, pushing Margaret down as the bullet shattered the window behind them. More shots followed, and suddenly the church was a battlefield. Stop, Reverend Carlyle roared. This is a house of God. But mob mentality had taken over. Men grabbed for Margaret and Joseph, murder in their eyes. Joseph fought with controlled efficiency, disabling without killing, but they were vastly outnumbered. Then, unexpectedly, help came from within. Several townspeople, the doctor who'd always been kind, the blacksmith who'd lost a son to senseless violence, women who were tired of their men's bloodlust, began pushing back against the mob. The church divided against itself, neighbor fighting neighbor. In the melee, Morrison grabbed Margaret, dragging her toward the door. You'll hang for this, savage whore! Joseph's knife flew true, striking Morrison's shoulder and forcing him to release her. As Morrison fell, clutching his wound, Joseph pulled Margaret toward the altar. Must get out. But she pulled back, climbing onto the pulpit. Look at yourselves, she cried out. Look what you've become. You came here to build civilization, and you've built nothing but hate. You call them savages. But who's acting savage now? Her words, or perhaps the sight of blood on the church floor, seemed to break the spell. The fighting slowed, stopped. People looked around as if waking from a nightmare, seeing their neighbors bloodied, their sanctuary defiled. Morrison, supported by his remaining allies, pointed at Margaret with his good arm. This isn't over. The army will come. They'll clean out every red-skinned devil and their sympathizers too. Then they'll find us ready," a new voice said. The doctor stepped forward, followed by several others. "I'm tired of this, tired of the killing, the hate. If standing for peace makes me a sympathizer, so be it." More voices joined his. Not many, but enough. The town was splitting, the consensus of hatred cracking. Morrison retreated, but his parting words were venomous. "You've chosen your side. Remember that when the blood flows." That night, in the doctor's house where they'd taken shelter, Margaret tended Joseph's bruises. "You shouldn't have come into the church," she said softly. "You stand for me, I stand for you. This is love." He caught her hand. "But Morrison, right? Army will come. Much blood coming." "Then we stop it," Margaret said fiercely. Somehow, over the next days, unexpected alliances formed. The doctor, Samuel Wright, used his influence to gather those willing to listen. Ruby organized the working girls as a surprisingly effective intelligence network. Even Reverend Carlyle, shaken by the violence in his church, began preaching sermons about peace and understanding. But Morrison and his faction were mobilizing too. They sent riders to the nearest fort, exaggerating the Indian uprising. They stockpiled weapons. They made lists of sympathizers to be dealt with when the army arrived. Joseph's people, warned by their scouts, prepared for war. Joseph rode between both camps, trying to prevent the inevitable. Margaret went with him, translating, pleading, building bridges word by word. At one meeting with the tribal elders, an old warrior spoke harshly to Joseph in their language. Margaret had learned enough to understand. "You bring white woman among us, you bring death," Joseph replied firmly, and Margaret added her own words in halting Lakota. "I bring myself. I choose this. Let me prove my heart is good." The elder studied her for a long moment, then spoke to the assembly. Later, Joseph translated, "He says you have courage, says maybe you are bridge the spirits send, but bridge can break and all fall." 3 days before the army was expected, a messenger arrived at dawn, but not from the fort. Jacques Dubois rode in with news that changed everything. "The territorial governor has heard about the situation. He's sending a peace commission, not troops, but they'll only negotiate if both sides lay down arms." It was a chance, slim but real. Margaret and Joseph worked tirelessly to convince both sides. Some listened, those tired of bloodshed, those who'd lost too much already. But others, like Morrison, saw only weakness in peace. The night before the commission's arrival, Morrison made his move. He and 20 armed men surrounded the doctor's house where Margaret and Joseph were staying. "Come out, traitor! Face justice!" Margaret stepped onto the porch, Joseph beside her. Behind them stood their supporters, a mix of townspeople and native warriors who'd chosen peace. "The only justice you want is a rope, Morrison. You've betrayed your race, your husband's memory, everything." Morrison's face was twisted with rage. "But I'll give you one chance. Renounce this savage. Come back to your own kind." Margaret looked at Joseph, then back at Morrison. "I found my own kind. They're the ones who choose love over hate, peace over war, truth over comfortable lies." She raised her voice. "I was wrong to vow I'd never let one of them touch me. That vow came from pain and ignorance. I choose a different vow now, to stand between hatred and hope, between the past and a better future." "Then you'll burn with them." Morrison raised his rifle. The shot came from behind Morrison. His wife stood there, smoking derringer in hand, having fired into the air. "Enough, Jake. I've stayed silent too long, but no more. You don't speak for this town. You don't speak for me." In the shocked silence that followed, more townspeople emerged from the darkness, men and women who'd found their courage, who'd chosen their side. Morrison's mob, outnumbered and uncertain now, began to melt away. Morrison himself, defeated and diminished, could only spit one last curse before retreating. "This isn't over." But in a way, it was. The Peace Commission arrived to find a town already choosing its future. Negotiations were difficult, compromises painful. But the foundation had been laid, not by politicians or soldiers, but by ordinary people who decided that the cycle of vengeance had to stop somewhere. As the commission met with both sides, Margaret stood with Joseph on the hill overlooking Bitter Creek. "I never thought I'd fight for this place," she said. "It gave me nothing but pain." "No," Joseph corrected gently. "Gave you strength, gave you choice, gave you me." She leaned into his embrace, watching the sun set over the troubled but changing town. "Thomas would be glad," she said suddenly. "He wanted to build something here. Maybe not this way, but something that would last. You build bridge," Joseph said. "Painful bridge, but strong. Others will cross after us." The morning after the confrontation, Bitter Creek woke to an uneasy peace. The Territorial Commission had set up camp between the town and the native encampment, their white tents like hopeful flags against the prairie grass. Margaret and Joseph worked tirelessly as interpreters and mediators. But the real work happened in smaller moments. A shared meal here, a medical treatment there, children playing together despite their parents' warnings. Jake Morrison, his arm in a sling, hadn't given up. He gathered his remaining supporters at his ranch, plotting ways to sabotage the peace talks. "They want us to live side by side with savages," he spat. "Next they'll want us to give them our land, our wives, our whole way of life." But his influence was waning. His wife had moved into town, staying with the doctor's family and speaking publicly about years of abuse. Other women followed her lead, finding their voices after too long in silence. The town that had once seemed monolithic in its hatred was revealing itself to be complex, fractured, capable of change. On the third day of negotiations, crisis struck. A young warrior, hot-headed and grieving his brother killed in an earlier conflict, attacked a supply wagon coming into town. No one was killed, but the incident gave Morrison the ammunition he needed. Within hours, he had riders spreading word that the peace talks were a sham, that the Indians were planning a massacre. "We have to leave," Joseph told Margaret as they watched armed riders gathering in the town square. "Too dangerous now." But Margaret had learned something in her months of loss and survival. Sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the most necessary. "No, we've come too far to run now. This is where we make our stand." That night, she did something that would have been unthinkable months ago. She walked into the native camp and asked to address the council. Joseph translated as she spoke from her heart. "I know what it is to lose everything. My husband died, and I blamed all of you. I wrapped myself in hatred because it was easier than facing my grief. But hatred is a poison that kills the one who drinks it. I've seen your kindness, your honor, your love for your families. I've seen that we're not so different. Please, don't let one young man's pain destroy what we're building here." The council listened in silence. Then, Standing Bear, the elder who had first questioned her presence, spoke at length. Joseph translated, his voice thick with emotion. "He says you speak truth, says the young warrior acted from grief, not from the council's will. They will surrender him for judgment, but only if the town also surrenders Morrison for his crimes." It was a test, and everyone knew it. Would the town apply justice equally, or would skin color determine the outcome? The next morning, Margaret stood before the commission and made the proposal public. The reaction was explosive. Morrison's faction crying betrayal, the peace faction arguing for true justice. Commissioner Bradley, a fair-minded man weary of frontier conflicts, saw the wisdom in it. "Equal justice under law," he said firmly. "That's what we're here to establish. Both men will be tried. Both will face consequences for their actions." Morrison tried to flee but was caught by his own former supporters, men tired of being led by hate. The trial that followed was unlike anything Bitter Creek had seen, native witnesses testifying alongside white ones. Margaret translating, ensuring every voice was heard. The young warrior, fox running, admitted his guilt but explained his actions. His brother had been shot while peacefully hunting. The killer never pursued. Morrison's crimes were laid out in detail. The attempted assault on Margaret, the false accusations, the incitement to violence. In the end, both men were sentenced. Fox running to a year's labor helping rebuild what violence had destroyed. Morrison to 5 years in territorial prison. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was a beginning. As the commission prepared to leave, establishing a framework for continued cooperation, Margaret found herself standing once again on the hill overlooking the town. But this time, she wasn't alone. A small group had gathered. Joseph's cousins, Dr. Wright and his family, Ruby and several of the working girls, even Reverend Carlyle. "What do we do now?" the Reverend asked, his voice uncertain but hopeful. "We build," Margaret said simply. "Not just buildings or farms, but understanding. It won't be easy. There will be setbacks, conflicts, days when the old hatred seems stronger than our hopes. But we build anyway," Joseph added. "My grandfather say, the longest journey begins with one step. We take many steps now, some forward, some back, but moving." Over the following weeks, that building began in earnest. A school was established where both native and white children could learn, with Margaret as one of the teachers. Joseph and other warriors helped patrol the area, preventing raids from both sides. Trade resumed at the crossing, carefully regulated but fair. Not everyone accepted the changes. Some families left Bitter Creek, unwilling to live in what they called a mongrel town. But others came, people drawn by the promise of a place where the past didn't entirely dictate the future. One evening, as Margaret and Joseph sat by their fire in their small cabin between the town and the native camp, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "I was so broken when you found me," she said softly, "frozen in more ways than one." Joseph traced the lines of her face with gentle fingers. "Not broken, like seed in winter ground, waiting for spring." "I hated you," she admitted. "All of you. I thought that hatred honored Thomas's memory. Now I know Thomas would want me to live, to love, to find peace. He was a dreamer. My Thomas. He wanted to build something good here, just not the way it happened." Joseph pulled her close. "We build his dream different way. Your dream, my dream, made one." The challenges continued. There were nights when rocks shattered their windows, days when neither community fully accepted them. Margaret faced women who called her traitor. Joseph faced warriors who named him weak. But there were also moments of grace, a child's laughter bridging languages, shared meals breaking down barriers, small kindnesses growing into friendships. 1 year after that terrible winter when she'd nearly died, Margaret stood in the same cemetery where she'd made her vow. Thomas's grave was well tended now, flowers growing around the marker. She knelt, placing a hand on the earth. "I kept the wrong promise for too long," she whispered. "I promised to hate when I should have promised to live, but I'm living now. Thomas, differently than we planned, but fully. I hope you understand." A warm wind stirred the grass, and for a moment, she could almost imagine Thomas's laugh, his easy acceptance of life's surprises. He would understand, she knew. He'd always been the one to see possibilities where others saw only problems. Joseph waited at the cemetery gate, respecting her need for this private moment. When she joined him, he took her hand without words. They walked through Bitter Creek together, an unthinkable sight just a year ago, now merely unusual. Progress came in small steps, but it came. At the trading post, now expanded into a meeting hall, they found the usual mixture, trappers and farmers, native hunters and white merchants, all conducting business with wary respect, if not friendship. Jacques Dubois grinned as they entered. "Ah, our bridge builders. Come, there's news from the territorial capital." The news was good. Their experimental community was being held up as a model, proof that peace was possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. Delegations would be coming to observe, to learn, to perhaps replicate their fragile success elsewhere. "We're not ready for that attention," Margaret protested. "Ready or not, change is coming," Morning Star said pragmatically. "Better to guide it than be swept away." That night, there was a gathering, not officially planned, but organically grown. Natives and townspeople mingled in the meeting hall, sharing food, music, stories. It wasn't perfect harmony. There were still suspicious glances, careful distances. But there was also laughter, curiosity, the first tentative reach toward understanding. Ruby raised a glass of sarsaparilla, since the Reverend was present. To Margaret Sullivan, who taught us that the hardest promises to break are sometimes the ones that need breaking most. The toast was echoed in multiple languages, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She'd been so alone that terrible winter, so certain her life was ending. Now she stood surrounded by an unlikely family, bonded not by blood, but by choice. Later, as she and Joseph walked home under a vast canopy of stars, she remembered her vow at Thomas's graveside. I will never let one of those savages touch me. The vow lay shattered, and in its place grew something infinitely more precious, a life built on truth rather than fear, love rather than hate, courage rather than the cold comfort of prejudice. Joseph's hand in hers was warm, calloused from work, gentle despite its strength. No regrets? He asked, reading her contemplative mood. No, she said firmly. No regrets, only gratitude. They paused at the rise overlooking their two worlds, the town lights on one side, the campfires on the other, and their small cabin sitting precisely between. A bridge made real. It wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The first chapter in a story that would be written by all who chose hope over hate. Margaret thought of the woman she'd been, bitter, broken, clinging to a vow that was slowly killing her. That woman had been transformed by the most unlikely catalyst, the compassion of one deemed enemy. Now she stood as living proof that the human heart, given chance and choice, could overcome even the deepest programmings of prejudice. The West was still wild, still dangerous, still divided. But here in this small corner of the frontier, people were choosing to write a different story, one where enemies could become lovers, where understanding could bloom in the most unlikely soil, and where the courage to break a vow could lead to the freedom to truly live. In the distance, a wolf howled. Not a threat, but a reminder of the wildness that surrounded them, the same wildness that lived in every human heart. The choice was always there, to fear it or to find the beauty in it. Margaret had made her choice, and with Joseph beside her, she faced whatever tomorrow would bring. The stars wheeled overhead, infinite and eternal, caring nothing for the human divisions below, and beneath their light, two people who should have been enemies walked home together, proof that love could indeed conquer all, not easily, not without cost, but ultimately, triumphantly. True. Thank you for listening to this story of love, loss, and redemption in the American frontier. I'm curious. Where are you listening from? Please share in the comments below. And let's connect across distances, just as Margaret and Joseph connected across divides. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about their journey. What touched your heart most about this unlikely love story?